If you don't have the support of the Pentagon and the State Department and the CIA, you lose your market. You become a tiny little island parked in the US rather than a big bad multinational corporation. When the Pentagon says something's disinformation, it's yes sir, may I please have another.
He's not just watching the government take control of the internet, he's doing something about it.
Mike Benz, executive director
of the Foundation for Freedom Online.
All the oil companies, all the gas companies, all the credit card companies, all the tech companies, they need the government's favors, so they do favors for the government. When the government says, hey, deplatform these people.
6 months ago, they completely deplatformed my channel. When I saw the Twitter files, now we actually know there were people from the FBI.
It's bigger than that. Above the military are the corporate and financial stakeholders of the activity of the military.
So when you read the Twitter files, you weren't shocked. You were like, yeah, this is business as usual in any company.
This is the tiniest little tip of the iceberg, and you ain't seen nothing yet.
What is their priority now for 24?
The grand plan is still the same. The State Department still wants to rig every election on Earth. Once this social media censorship power was debuted, they really saw this kind of El Dorado for how to control elections all around the world.
Now we also have this AI component.
AI is not some future hypothetical threat. You are living in the AI censorship era.
Mike, I'm curious, if you could snap your fingers and change the world right now, what do you want to happen?
First and foremost, we need a robust whole of society free speech alliance.
Everybody has to be conscious of this, and everyone has to be thinking about it all the time and moving the ball forward.
I've seen so many of my friends swallowed up or indicted by the Justice Department on BS, and I have no doubt that that's going to happen to me at some point. I see myself as a vehicle for a message, and I'm going to keep singing that song as long as there's a microphone in front of me.
Hi, it's Brian Rose from London Real. You probably know that we've just recently been re-platformed on YouTube after 25 months completely in the dark. The truth is, I really need your help. What I really need you to do is click on that subscribe button right now, like this video, and maybe even leave a comment or share the link with friends. We're really fighting against an algorithm that's tried to keep us quiet for so long. And the more subscribers we have, the more people watch our content, the better guests we can bring you, the better content, and we can continue transforming lives. We've been doing this for 14 years now. I want to do this for another 14 years, but I really need your help. So click on that subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment, share this, and we're going to continue to bring you more and more great content. Thank you. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Mike Benz, the technology lawyer, free speech advocate, and author. You are the executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online, the free speech watchdog dedicated to restoring the promise of a free and open internet. You previously spent time as a speechwriter and technology advisor under the Donald Trump administration before moving into the State Department as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Technology. You have been critical of the government's role in the social media censorship that has become an increasing presence in all of our lives, with your work being cited in congressional hearings and promoted by Elon Musk. Ultimately, you want people to take a stand for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the free exchange of ideas online. You believe that we are witnessing a blatant inversion of democracy that will dangerously increase as we head into the election season. Mike, welcome to London Real.
Thank you, Brian. I feel like I've just read the tarot card. This is that I couldn't have expressed, I think, what I stand for better than that introduction. The only thing that I would add is that the author aspect is an in-process thing. The book that I've been writing for 8 years is still in the unpublished phase, but it is the subject, I think, of what we're talking about, weapons of mass deletion, and how AI censorship came to dominate speech on the internet and entrapped even organizations like your own.
Wow. Well, that's going to be a must-read for sure. And look, I can't wait to jump in here, Mike. You just have some really novel and fascinating and, quite frankly, terrifying ideas and concepts and revelations. And I can't wait to jump into it. But I'd love it if we could look through the lens of my experiences at London Real, because when I read your breakdown of kind of the censorship apparatus, going back even to the 40s, but then going up to the 90s and the noughties and then the teens, it weirdly parallels my experience on London Real. And I want to give people maybe a quick synopsis of what happened here. And then I want to get maybe your thoughts of what was actually happening. Because here I was, an ex-banker. In 2011, I decide I want to be the next Joe Rogan, right? Or the Joe Rogan in London. And I quit my job as a banker, and I literally set up in my kitchen and I started talking to people and putting it on YouTube. Like, that's literally what I did. There was no business model. There was no nothing. I was an introvert. I had no experience in broadcasting, but I felt a need to do this. And everything was great. And we were broadcasting along and building our brand. No one had heard of a podcast really in the world, definitely not in London. And we started getting a bigger and bigger audience. I always was waiting and hoping to get recognition from mainstream media. It never really happened. But we slowly grew and grew and grew, and maybe even built or helped build some of these networks as we produced this content that was consumed on them. Now, clock into 2020, 9 years later, I am broadcasting on April 6th. I have the second largest YouTube live stream in the world, and I have a 70-year-old man in the chair that's asking questions about lockdowns and distancing and masks and talking about these potential vaccines that we couldn't even see coming. And Mike, 30 minutes after that video that would have been gone on to be watched, the most watched video podcast in history, it was trending to beat the, at the time, Joe Rogan, Elon Musk 40 million number. That video was deleted and banned on YouTube. I had been broadcasting for 9 years, Mike, and I had never had that happen once in my life. And my initial reaction was bewilderment and then anger, because I grew up in America and this felt like a fundamental right that was being taken away from me. And again, I'd never experienced it before, ever. And that started a huge fight between us and YouTube and a lot of the technology platforms who continued to ban our content, shadow ban us, actually ban us. And again, it culminated in regulators stopping us, bank accounts being shut down. And that was all of 2020. And then 6 months ago, we were finally permanently deplatformed from YouTube. And so for us, it was a pretty shocking thing to happen. But now that I look back on what happened, Mike, through the lens of what you have seen happen over the last couple decades, it seems really obvious to me that it got to a point where potentially our messages were maybe starting to conflict. And so that's been our story here. We have continued to broadcast, but it's been continuing to be a struggle out there. And once I read the Twitter files and then learned more about what you do, I would love to get your thoughts of kind of what I experienced maybe in the early days when these media platforms were being used to get ideas out there, and then later, how they were actually being used to silence people. And so I'm curious, Mike, if you see things that I might not see in my story, because here I am, I don't really see what's going on the outside, and yet it seems like you have a good perspective of what was going on the outside.
Yeah, well, the timing of that's really fascinating. You mentioned it was April 2020, right? That was when that interview was that
Correct.
Sort of got the first crack in the dam. Well, that happens to coincide exactly with the April 2020 Graphica report on how to stop conspiracy theories about COVID from floating around on the internet. Graphica is a Pentagon cutout. It was born in the Minerva Initiative. The Minerva Initiative is the Psychological Warfare Research Center of the Pentagon. Graphica itself has gotten $7 million in Pentagon contracts. Prior to COVID, they were principally helping the Pentagon identify social media narratives in conflict zones where the CIA and the Pentagon were operating. The chief strategy officer there had spent 25 years at the CIA. They basically did that military and intelligence social media network mapping work that became so pivotal in the run-up to and after the Arab Spring. Then they were repurposed for COVID censorship starting in December 2019. Between January 2020 and April 2020, they spent 4 months doing a detailed social media mapping of all voices, all political movements, all sort of highly influential media channels, all across NATO, US, UK, Canada, and then into Central and Eastern Europe. identifying all the influential voices and what they were saying to the extent that it was heterodox with official government messaging on COVID. They published this in April 2020, along with a roadmap on how to silence these voices on social media. And I would actually love to go back into that report and see if London Real is mentioned. Although, like I said, that was the same month that was published that you apparently had your messages taken off the internet. And, the whole COVID censorship story is really a story of the blob. It's a story of the foreign policy establishment, the sort of joint U.S., UK, transatlantic national security state, as well as its corporate and financial stakeholders who essentially are now in a kind of open conflict with the citizens of the homeland, the people who live there versus the managers of the empire, because their own funding and their own mandate is dependent on the votes of the people and the hearts and minds of the people. So in order to keep the people controlled, in order to keep the money flowing and the mandate flowing to them, they have become extremely active in control over social media, because now social media is where even the reach of legacy media is. So, I mean, there's a whole lot more there. But, the first thing off the top is April 2020 happens to immediately coincide with when the consensus started to form within the foreign policy establishment around the necessity of censoring alternative views on COVID-19. May I ask also, did you cover COVID origins in addition to vaccines on that discussion?
Yeah, we pretty much covered everything. I mean, in time, we would cover everything. And when speaking with that guest, yeah, I think at the time we started talking about, Wuhan and all the rest. I mean, we were covering a lot of things. And it's weird, Mike, because I have recorded conversations with me and YouTube reps where I'm trying to get to the heart of why I'm being banned. And they're saying things like, anything you say against WHO policy now is being taken down, but sometimes they contradict themselves. And, we're right at the tip of the spear where, and again, it wasn't just one platform. It was like everything in concert. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Like I always say, I leave that to my guests. But when when PayPal shuts you down and LinkedIn pulls your account and Dropbox removes all your content, even though I didn't know they were actually looking at my content, and then YouTube pulls you and Facebook and Instagram are shadow ban you all at the same time, you start to wonder. Now, later when I saw the Twitter files, it was like, oh, okay, now we actually know there were people from the FBI and the Senate subcommittees pushing through. But when you talk about this blob, that's the first time that I've ever heard anyone really talk about it in real terms, that there are these real groups that are out there really trying to push this narrative. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you don't need to call it a conspiracy. You can just use their own term for it. It's called whole of society. All of these government stakeholders, in the U.S., it's things like DHS, Pentagon, State Department, FBI, HHS, our Health and Human Services, and for COVID, and NIAID and CDC. They have something for control over information online that they call the whole of society model. Now, they call it the whole of society counter misinformation, counter disinformation network. But they don't mean countering it with counter speech. They mean countering it by getting all the other aspects of the whole of society network to censor it. And the whole of society is comprised of these four different categories of institutions. There's the government side, and they call that whole of government. Those are those ones we just talked about. Then there's the private sector side, which are the private sector companies. So those are things like the tech platforms, the financial institutions, the censorship technology mercenary firms that we can get into, and as well as the sort of corporate social responsibility endowment arms of some of these private sector institutions. Then the third category is you have government, you have private sector. The third category is civil society, and those are the nonprofits, the foundations, the think tanks, the NGOs, as well as basically onboarded activist and researcher, entities. And then the fourth category is media and fact checking, which are basically politically like-minded legacy media institutions, as well as this whole, newly capacity built swarm of government financed fact checker institutions, places like the Poynter Institute, and other big umbrella groups. So, those four categories, the government, private sector, civil society, and news media and fact checking, all move completely in concert, very, very, very deliberately. Again, this whole society model goes back to 2017, which is when it was set up within the sort of State Department DHS axis, which itself sort of has these intelligence origins in places like the Atlantic Council. But it goes back decades before that, because they borrowed that from our counterinsurgency model. Counterinsurgency is what the Pentagon and the CIA do to manage foreign populations who have a political movement rising in a foreign country that might topple a U.S. installed dictator or a U.S. installed puppet government. We have counterterrorism, which is when that involves violence. We have counterinsurgency, which is when there's an insurgent political group who might unseat a preferred political party that is giving us a sweet deal on oil and gas, or a sweet deal on rare earth minerals, or is allowing us to have a U.S. military base, or is voting with us in a UN vote. So we have a very special set of skills to manage the rise of political dissidents in a place where we don't want them to gain entry politically. And that's called our whole society model for counterinsurgency. They basically took that for free speech on the internet. And so now you have, when you have a consensus within the foreign policy establishment, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the CIA, that immediately moves into the financial institutions, that immediately moves into the tech companies, that immediately moves into the NGO swarms and the think tanks, and that immediately moves into the legacy media and the fact checker network. They're all together at the same meetings. They're all part of this same consensus building apparatus. And, part of this is because they all depend on the government for international favors. A great example of this is, the financial institutions are totally in league with the foreign policy establishment, even in places like Ukraine. It was USAID, which is the CIA's number one funding conduit for clandestine operations. USAID and the U.S. State Department jointly coerced President Zelensky in Ukraine, starting in 2019 when he was elected, to use this digital identity app called DIA, DIIA. And that basically puts every Ukrainian citizen, it's called a state in a smartphone, where all the state services are all linked up in an app on everyone's phones. This links their social media accounts and their digital identity to their bank accounts. So if they decide that they don't like President Zelensky, now they can all have their bank accounts nuked. But it was USAID who got them to do it in partnership with Amex and Visa, who are now have a totally captive market in that region because their monopoly is protected by the Pentagon. This happens all over the world. All the oil companies, all the gas companies, all the credit card companies, all the tech companies rely on the battering ram of the State Department, the Defense Department, and our intelligence community to protect and secure their markets and investments in abroad. I used to be in that job when I was at State. And, I've talked to all these people in the private sector. They need the government's favors, so they do favors for the government. When the government says, hey, deplatform these people, take these people up. We have a new initiative around misinformation. No funding goes to this. The advertisers comply. The financial institutions comply. The tech companies comply because they need the help from the government concurrently.
So when you read the Twitter files, you weren't shocked. You were like, yeah, this is business as usual in any company, not just to mention a tech company or a social media company.
Yeah, I was screaming my head off. This is the tiniest little tip of the iceberg, and you ain't seen nothing yet. Right. I mean, it's, but I was a part of those Twitter files as well. I worked with Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger on helping to sort of explain that. And, it was a very important thing for people to see, because seeing it internally at Twitter gave another layer of depth to what was already available open source through government's disclosures from lawsuits. And I think it gave a lot of confidence to the House of Representatives here in the U.S. that subpoenaing for more information is not going to send you on a wild goose chase, because you already know who's CC'd on these emails. You already know, there were leads that I think gave confidence. I think before that, a lot of people, weren't totally sure, how deep the rabbit hole went, or they didn't necessarily believe it just when they saw, snippets from YouTube videos, or they saw disclosures from lawsuits. And also, I think knowing that this was happening week after week for 25 weeks, and knowing that Elon Musk who was the wealthiest person in the world and had a tremendous amount of social clout from all the different, companies that are mission critical, even to the U.S. government, like SpaceX and Tesla, was willing to turn over the dirty underwear, so to speak, of his own company. I think gave a lot of confidence to other actors in the free speech community at the legislative and at the government level to keep going. And that was really a huge boon, I think, to the free speech movement.
Yeah, it was powerful. Although, since the mainstream media give it zero coverage, I still bump into people and say, the Twitter files, right? And they're like, no, I don't really know what you're talking about. I'm like, what? I mean, this was such a big thing. I guess I'm in this whole freedom of speech chamber, but it seemed like such a big deal and so revelatory. But they did a good job, though, of keeping it quiet by not giving it any coverage. And again, when I saw those, I just wanted to see the YouTube files and I wanted to see what was going on. And I guess you were thinking, well, there's also the oil company files and the banking files. And for you, this is business as usual. But for a lot of people, they didn't know that. And every time someone would pose that or posit that idea, they say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Oh, that stuff would never happen. And I guess it's so easy to wash that, put that under the rug because they've been doing that for decades, right?
Yeah, well, we actually have started to see some of those other files. So Jim Jordan, who's the chair of the House Weaponization Subcommittee here in our Congress, he subpoenaed all of the major tech companies after the Twitter files, and it came out, in the Facebook files that the House published. It turned out that the White House itself, Rob Slattery, who was running the White House digital strategy office, was personally telling Facebook to tweak their algorithm to super promote the New York Times and to de-amplify voices like Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire. And he was, literally the White House micromanaging the algorithm of Facebook and Facebook's internal communications around, God, this is a really weird and harsh request, but we need the government. So what do we do in this situation? Even the Amazon files just came out, because they were included in the subpoena sweep from Jim Jordan. And it turned out that the White House was telling Amazon to ban books that were critical of COVID-19 orthodoxies. So, you had top-down government, manual book burning digitally.
What about Google? I got a big beef with Google because they broke my heart. I put everything into my YouTube channel, and I have a new documentary film called We Will Not Be Silenced that is actually winning awards and film festivals all over the world. We've won 20 film festivals. I'll actually be in Myrtle Beach next month for a screening of the movie, and I'll be there for a freedom of speech symposium with Dr. Robert Malone. I'll be there with Dr. David E. Martin and Robert Kiyosaki, who's a good friend of mine. We should get you up there as well, Mike. And we'll be talking about these issues. And it's really important because 6 months ago, they completely deplatformed my channel. And this had, 500 million views, 14,000 videos, 2.4 million subscribers. And 99% of the content was content that changed people's lives and made a massive positive impact on the world. And 1% of it was quote unquote medical misinformation. And it still bothers me because I feel like my human rights were violated and my First Amendment rights are violated, and these are felonies, and somebody should go to jail and I should get reparations and I should get my damn channel back. Do I have any hope of doing that? And is anybody going after Google? And is it possible to go after that company, or is it more powerful than everyone else, Mike?
Yeah, Google is really the great Goliath in this whole story. Google is, in the words of Julian Assange in an article that he wrote, this is the verbatim title, Google is not what it seems. Google, I always joke that it's not a joke, but I always sort of say a little bit tongue in cheek that none of the tech companies wanted to go through with the internet censorship protocols that were forced on them by the government between 2017 and 2020, and which continues today. Jack Dorsey didn't want to deplatform President Trump. He came out later and said it was a business decision. They were forced to do it. Mark Zuckerberg said in 2019 in a speech in San Jose that the pendulum of censorship had swung too far, and that he wanted to swing it back towards freedom of speech, and then ended up censoring more than ever because of the sort of government-induced coercion that continued on him. The one exception to this is Google. Google did not have to be prodded too hard to do this. They, I think, did it gleefully. And part of that is because Google really is an extension of the foreign policy establishment itself. There's a much clearer line between Twitter and the U.S. government, and even between Facebook and the U.S. government, than there is between Google. Google itself started, as a CIA NSA project in a certain respect. I mean, now I don't think that Larry Page and Sergey Brin would agree with that characterization. It's a bit glib, but the fact is Google started in 1996, and it started because of the work that was done in 1995 out of a DARPA grant that the two founders had at Stanford when they were PhD students working on, the backbone architecture of Google, which was again funded by DARPA, the Pentagon, and specifically a joint CIA NSA program called the Massive Digital Data Services Program at DARPA, which was this joint CIA NSA data collection sweep to try to see how, quote, birds of a feather were flocking together in the newly privatized internet. So, in 1991, the World Wide Web came out, and Web 1.0 was forums and blogs and static.com websites. And these were immediately piped into dissident groups around the world that were being funded by the CIA and were being liaised with the State Department and were being instrumentalized by the Pentagon in order to help those dissident groups develop their own independent media and communication channels in countries where there was state control over media. So it allowed them to basically popularize their ideas and create a critical mass to overthrow a government that the CIA and the Pentagon, the State Department wanted deposed, so to speak. So in order to track the spread of that information, to see how political groups are using this newly open internet, there was this birds of a feather flocking together program that Larry Page and Sergey Brin were a part of in 1995 at Stanford. And Stanford is now continues to be the number one place where they were the number one place for digital freedom in the 1990s and 2000s. And they were one of the 4 universities that, when DARPA turned over the internet to the National Science Foundation before the World Wide Web, Stanford was one of the 4 central university nodes in that web. Today it's actually the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is this kind of CIA hotbed within Stanford that was largely responsible for so much of COVID censorship. They started something called the Virality Project, which chopped up 4 different categories of COVID dissent. And then we talked about COVID origins. And we talked about COVID mandates or lockdowns or masks, or even conspiracy theories about individuals like Peter Daszak or Tony Fauci were all being tracked by this, essentially CIA State Department cell within Stanford that captured hundreds of millions of social media content using their, sort of AI powered, toolkit that we might get to. These are the weapons of mass deletions that I talk about. But essentially, Google started out that way. They started out, being powered by the CIA, the NSA, and the Pentagon. The only reason that they had the amazing tools that they did, like Google Maps wasn't this, amazing project that Google came up with. They bought the keyhole satellite technology for Google Maps directly from the Central Intelligence Agency. That was a CIA satellite software that they purchased. The CIA hadn't come up with that. Google wouldn't have it. And Google became a military contractor in 2004, the first year they went private. They were always an arm of the national security state. They always had their monopoly because they were protected by the U.S. government. There was never daylight between government and Google. And in fact, the very start of the censorship industry really comes from Google. It was Jared Cohen who was the man who, in many respects, is sort of the godfather of the censorship industry. This was. Do I have time to go off on this?
Please. I'm finding this fascinating.
Yeah. So the way we did dirty tricks in the 20th century in the U.S. empire, and by the way, you can make the argument that this was all for the good of the world at the time. I don't necessarily, believe that, but I think that there are schools of thought that say, you need a Department of Dirty Tricks because it's a mean world out there. And if you don't do it, somebody else will. And you could argue as a U.S. citizen that it redounded to the benefit of the U.S. The reason that we had cheaper gas than Europe or other countries is because we had domination over oil and gas, which was made possible only because of our dirty tricks powers from the Pentagon, the CIA. Same thing with our export markets. We had Bethlehem Steel, and how could we export steel to all these other countries? Well, we pried them open using our, Department of Dirty Tricks, so to speak. It wasn't all arm's length trading. It was getting favorable governments in place by overthrowing governments who resisted us. My beef with this comes, and I'm saying this because, wearing my diplomat hat, I think it's important for people to know I'm not just opposed to all this on principle. It's because it was weaponized against U.S. citizens. And they did the same tricks to us starting in 2016 when they didn't like who we were voting for because they didn't like, the way we were using the internet and who we were supporting online to circumvent legacy media. But anyway, going back to Google, we ran our diplomacy and statecraft operations, our intelligence underworld, through embassies, consulates, and CIA station houses for the entirety of the 20th century. From the 1940s through, basically the early 2000s, everything was done. If we wanted to overthrow a government in Iran, for example, we would have an embassy set up there. We'd have consulates, we'd have CIA station houses, and we'd work with dissident groups manually in an analog fashion, or in Tunisia or in Egypt, as we saw with the Arab Spring. With the rise of social media in 2004, you had Facebook 2004, you had YouTube 2005, you had Twitter 2006, and then you had the smartphone in 2007, which made it really ubiquitous and mobile. There began to be a new power for running covert operations, for running regime change at a scale that never existed in the analog era. And this becomes a Google story because of a guy named Jared Cohen, who was this whiz kid who I think at the age of something like 26 was recruited to basically the inner sanctum of coordinating State Department and CIA operations within the State Department. It's the policy planning staff. This guy was a Republican. Cohen was a Republican pick from Condoleezza Rice. So a Bush Republican political appointee. And he looked around in his late 20s. He had done a lot of work. He had created something called movements.org. And, had this whole sort of Rhodes Scholar network where he had been embedded within these sort of Middle East, North Africa groups as a kid. And, a lot of what the CIA and State Department do for revolutions is working with youth movements, student groups, young people, because they provide the rent-a-riot street muscle that is necessary for the end stage of running the actual government out of office. As you can see in, for example, the footage of Yugoslavia, they surround the parliament building and run out of office. Same thing with the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. So Jared Cohen came to this State Department CIA inner sanctum with a sort of young person's knowledge of, how people were using this new social media apparatus in the early 2000s. And he looked around at all these 40, 50, 60-year-olds who were stuck in the sort of analog era. And he said, what are we doing running these operations out of CIA station houses and embassy consulates? Everyone we want to recruit's on Facebook. Everyone's on Twitter. You got people making YouTube videos. You can get 100,000 people in the street simply by creating a hashtag, simply by, you don't need to spend 11 months running, money out of, running unmarked bills out of black duffel bags and, talking to leaders and them talking to the lieutenants and them talking to their own masses in the region. You can centralize this all on social media. So he came up with a doctrine jointly with Condoleezza Rice that was known as Diplomacy 2.0 or digital statecraft. And this was deemed to be so mission critical to the State Department's work that Jared Cohen was kept on at state when there was a changeover from Republican to Democrat when Barack Obama won the 2008 presidential election, and you had Hillary Clinton become the Secretary of State. And so, Hillary Clinton and Jared Cohen kept that game running, and it culminated in 2010, 2011 in the high watermark of free speech on the internet, the Arab Spring, which is when Tunisia and Egypt and one by one, all of these governments who were declared authoritarians and wanted to be toppled by the Obama administration were all toppled in Facebook revolutions and in Twitter revolutions. And at that point, Jared Cohen was the talk of Washington. People were talking, this kid's going to be president. This young guy before the age of 30 was declared by Time magazine as one of the 50 most powerful people in Washington. He could have done anything. And he sort of surprised the entire foreign policy establishment world when he decided to leave the State Department at the height of his power, so to speak, and celebrity, to join what was at the time a company that was not even in the top 100 by market cap. It was only 120, I think, in 2010. And it was this mid-sized company called Google. Yeah. And Jared Cohen was given a very strange job at Google, which is to sit in a room by himself and stare at a white wall and think about all of the interesting ways that Google could use its proprietary resources and data to solve complex geopolitical problems. This was the moment that Julian Assange sort of, picked up on and wrote about, where he described this as the moment that Google became the shadow State Department, with Jared Cohen serving as the CIA State Department liaison directly to Eric Schmidt. Him and Eric Schmidt would become thick as thieves. They would co-write a book together on the future of democracy in the digital age. And it would be from there, Jared Cohen took a very keen interest in the 2016 presidential election and would then turn this one-person think tank, Google Ideas, into a new vehicle called Google Jigsaw, which would go on to create the first retail weapons of mass deletion, the AI censorship technology that started off being funded by DARPA, the same way Google started off being funded by DARPA, essentially. And these were the AI censorship tools that would come to ensnare none other than London Real.
Wow. I did not even know about that history. How come no one's talked about this before? Because I haven't heard these ideas. Tucker hadn't heard these ideas. Most people haven't. How come it took you to really articulate them to the world?
Well, I've been screaming about them to the top of my lungs for eight years. I think what it's taken has been a couple of sort of strange, fortuitous bounces in geopolitical affairs and in the natural sort of momentum it takes for things to break through, in the sense that, when I first started talking about this in late 2016 and 2017, and I said, look at these DARPA grants, look at this thing called natural language processing, which basically treats online speech on the internet like a chess position, looks at moves and allows you to micro-target every different misinformation community in the world. This is going to wipe out, all speech on the internet that's opposed to the Pentagon priorities. And everyone would say, oh, that's crazy. They're not, first of all, how do you really know? Just because it's in a DARPA white paper doesn't mean they're actually going to do it. And so, well, here they're doing it. Here they're funding. There's this group. Here's here's the Atlantic Council, and here's the 7 CIA directors on the board. They get annual funding from the Pentagon. They're using this for this. Well, it's okay. Well, what are the specific accounts that are being targeted by that? Okay, well, then it takes a year for that to come out, for that to happen. And at the time, people didn't want to believe, by the way, any of this was happening for the first 3 years. When I was in the White House talking about this and doing my morning Mecca between the first and third floor, telling everybody, that the sky was falling down. I was Chicken Little. It was people didn't want to even think this story was possible because of how much it would require inverting the pretty little world and the little comforts they could take, thinking that they could take on internet censorship at a much easier level. I'll give you a great example of this. Is the Trump administration, and I'm not casting aspersions on this, by the way. The administration has to deal with a whole different set of pressures that I didn't have to deal with, dealing with the donors and dealing with, coalitions and alliances in Congress, and then dealing with the base and messaging and 12,000 other issues on both domestic and foreign policy. It's easy to understand the instinct that I think that the Trump White House had, which was, if what you're telling me is true, we can't stop this anyway because of all the other things or other balls that would have to drop, or because we need favors from this coalition for this and that. So in 2019, 2020, there was something very fashionable around something called Section 230. You may recall this. This was basically a protection from defamation and other kinds of tort liability, a safe harbor that was given to internet platforms if they were independent and neutral, that distinguished them from publishers. So, for example, social media are said to be platforms rather than publishers under this Section 230 law, because if I make a tweet that, say, hypothetically defames another person on Twitter, for example, then someone could sue me for defamation, for example, on that, but can't sue Twitter just for hosting that platform, only because Twitter is under Section 230 deemed to be a platform rather than publishing my tweet itself. So if the New York Times were to have said the same thing, someone could sue the New York Times. But if the New York Times puts that same article on Twitter, then Twitter won't be held liable, only because of this platform publisher distinction. The New York Times is a publisher. Twitter is simply hosting that. So, it became very evident in 2019, 2020, after, 2017 was when this consensus building architecture really came out. 2018 was when it all started to really get set up. 2019 is when it really started to snowball and heads started to fall, online, from the political censorship of early 2019 into the COVID censorship that would happen starting in December 2019. And so, Section 230 was sort of, had a lot of attention in the early days in 2019, 2020, even 2021, because if you could simply say, hey, you know what, these Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you guys have become publishers now. And so we're going to remove your safe harbor because you're making editorial decisions about what is postable on your platforms in the same way that publishers do. You are really a publisher now, because I can't publish freely on your platform if I'm a COVID dissident, or I don't believe mail-in ballots are safe and secure, or I've got this, this perception on things like immigration or other things that were deemed to be, hate speech or misinformation. So there was a very strong argument to be able to, repeal those Section 230 protections if you could solve the complex sort of legislative Chinese finger trap of it all. And so there's a natural desire, I think, for people to want to focus on easy solutions at the legislative level that wouldn't require them to do trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat with the Pentagon or the State Department or the CIA or 10,000 different NGO institutions on USAID or National Endowment for Democracy payroll, or to sort of. No one wanted to stare directly into the sun. No one wanted to believe it. And so, I think it took, until late into, once the cancer had already metastasized, for people to actually come to grips with what they were actually up against.
Wow. You've said before, quote unquote, what I'm describing is military rule. That's a strong statement, Mike. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's bigger than that in the sense that, above the military are the corporate and financial stakeholders of the activity of the military. The military itself, is run by a sort of general class. And, in second or third world countries, we call them juntas. In the U.S., we simply call them, 4 stars, or, the sort of Mark Milley class. But, above that are the corporations and financial stakeholders who essentially provide the choice and the staffing of that. So, the military is not necessarily where the money is. The reason you become a multimillionaire as a 4-star general isn't because of your salary, while working for the military. It's the work that you do after that, when you go on to be an advisor or a member of the board and get a big equity share in Boeing or Raytheon or BAE Systems if you're in the UK. Michael Chertoff's a great example of this. He was the guy who was the first full-term DHS secretary here in the U.S. He's a guy who is another one of these godfather figures of the censorship industry. He was the functional head of the Aspen Institute's cyber working group, which was the sort of central command in many respects for censorship thought leadership. He's the guy who went on to become the interim head of the Disinformation Governance Board at the Department of Homeland Security. Well, what did he do after he left government under the Bush administration running DHS? He went to become the chairman of BAE Systems, which is UK's equivalent of Boeing, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin combined. BAE functionally runs the British Ministry of Defense. And Chertoff also started a private sector group called the Chertoff Group, which does a lot of this geopolitical advisory group. And, one of the first people they picked up there was General Michael V. Hayden when he retired from being the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, and being a 4-star general for the U.S. government. So you have this rotating class between the military and the corporate and financial class. But, when I refer to military rule, it's because the military is essentially doing the dirty work of the corporate and financial class. They're essentially the executioners of the judicial edicts coming from that corporate and financial aspect of the blob. And the military does a lot more than just straight military. We have 4 theaters of war, and according to U.S. military doctrine, we've got the strategic, which is, the sort of grand strategy for how to win militarily. We have the tactical, which are the specific operations. The third category.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website, londonreal.tv, or click the link in the description below.
So Jim Rickards has just recorded a video that's not available to anyone in the public, and he's going to be talking about how this upcoming recession is going to be fast, it's going to be bloody, it's going to be nasty. But at the same time, he's going to show you how you can position yourself to profit from all of this chaos. Now, we've made this video only available to our viewers. Go to londonreal.tv/Jim. Watch that immediately. I can't say enough good things about Jim Rickards. He understands the global economic system better than any guest I've ever had on London Real. His predictions are almost uncannily true, and you can learn how to profit from his vision, from his expertise, and his understanding of economics. So go to londonreal.tv/Jim or click the link below. It's an excellent, excellent look on what's going to happen in the future and how you can position yourself to profit from that. Jim is one of the best in the business, one of my favorite guests on London Real, and he's very, very good at predicting the future and showing us all to profit from it. So click the link, and I hope you enjoy. Hey, it's Brian Rose, founder of the DeFi Academy. I've told you my 4-week crypto bootcamp is amazing, but don't take my word for it. This is what my students are saying.
The DeFi Academy was an amazing experience for me. It took me totally out of my comfort zone.
In this course, I was challenged, I was held accountable, and pushed to do things that honestly weren't always easy.
It's been phenomenal, and I can't believe we're already up on our 4 weeks. It has flown by.
Going through this DeFi accelerator by far was one of the best courses I've taken.
You do this course, you really get into the nitty-gritty of the activities that will make you comfortable with decentralized finance.
Thank you so much to Brian and everyone at London Real and the DeFi Academy for even putting together an amazing course like this.
Anybody else that wants to do it, please sign up. It is well worth the money.
Most people will never see this opportunity. Dubai luxury transformation projects have historically delivered 40 to 90% annual returns. That is incredible. These were once reserved only for insiders with access. I spent 15 years on Wall Street, and I learned this. The biggest returns always go to the people who get the call first. Now, you finally can. We've just received a brand new project with major upside potential. Allocations move fast. Click the link, apply now, and speak to my team. This is your chance to see what others never will.